Well, hi everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sassan Saatchi. Dr. Saatchi is a principal scientist for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's Carbon Cycle and Ecosystem Group. His research has advanced our understanding of the role of forests in the global carbon cycle, particularly in the Amazon and Congo basins. He has won many awards for his research, including the Edward Stone Award for his benchmark maps of tropical forest carbon stocks. Today, he will be sharing his research on the role of boreal, temperate, and tropical forests and the interannual variability of the atmospheric CO2 growth rate. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Saatchi.
Thank you, Nicole. And let me start. I'm so pleased that I'm giving this seminar. I was hoping that I would be there in person with all of you and get more engaged in chatting and discussing research. But hopefully we're not that far away. So the next opportunity comes when we all go back to work. I would definitely visit to see you all in person. So what I like to do today is basically show you some recent results from our work as looking at the global carbon cycle and trying to see how the land, especially terrestrial biosphere, contribute to global carbon cycle. This is the work that I've been doing for a while. In tropics, but also in general in the Northern Hemisphere as well. And we have, some of this work has been published or at least reviewed positively. Some of them are still in review, and I'll try to go over them with some level of introduction on the global carbon cycle. And let me see, do you see my slides well? I can put it in the presentation mode. So I'm going to cover a little bit the global carbon budget and the role of the terrestrial biosphere, and then discuss how we deal with the vegetation carbon balance using a combination of whatever data we have from ground inventory data, from airborne and satellite data to tackle this problem. And then I'll, at the end, basically discuss the role of the tropics, which seems to be extremely important for at least the terrestrial part of the global carbon cycle, or maybe even larger than that. Here is a slide that actually summarizes some of the observations that we have for the carbon in the atmosphere.
Dr. Saatchi, I don't know if you're currently sharing your screen with us.
Oh, I'm not? So
I don't see it.
Okay, let me just go back and then do share screen. Maybe I stopped that. How about now?
It looks good.
Okay. So globally, if there was no perturbations in the climate system and carbon cycle, it's in a very natural setting. I don't know when that natural setting was, maybe before human, the carbon budget would be completely balanced. That means at least on the oceans and the land, the delta C, the changes of the carbon would have been zero, and there wouldn't be any major changes. But as soon as the perturbation starts from either land use activities through agriculture or through climate, through any other human mix with the climate activities, a small imbalance in the carbon can result in a large, basically, variability in terms of the gross emissions and uptakes at different parts of the whole system, including atmosphere, oceans, and the land part. So we are at the present time dealing with this period where perturbation has already happened. Changes on the land surface has occurred. We are producing fossil fuel in the atmosphere, and this is the typical killing curve that I'm sure everybody is familiar with, that shows our observations in the atmosphere carbon is increasing. If you take the year-to-year change of that carbon, which basically is the atmospheric growth rate, you see that that year-to-year change also shows a large variability, but also an increasing in the atmosphere. And so far, our observations has been limited in terms of quantifying different components that contribute to this growth rate. In terms of fossil fuel, which is the figure A at the bottom, there has been some records put together from fossil fuel and cements, and that shows an increasing carbon in the atmosphere. And from 1960s to present, which the data is a little bit better. And if you divide it into the countries, you can actually see the contribution of each region globally, or countries: US, China, Europeans, and India. And you notice that China, from early part of the 2000, has really increased in terms of their emission to the atmosphere. If you look at the per capita, you notice that US is still staying pretty high up compared to other countries in the world. So this is mainly the observations that we have on the on what's going on in the atmosphere and the human contribution to it in terms of basically fossil fuel burning. If you go to balancing this carbon, you have to deal with the sources and sinks. And sources are the ones that basically we input to the atmosphere, we emit to the atmosphere, and sinks are basically the uptake of the system from the atmosphere. So we know, since we measure the atmospheric carbon, that half of what we put in the atmosphere is basically stays there. The rest of it gets absorbed. And from what we put in is the fossil fuel and also land cover land use change, which is the part that I'm going to be focusing on, and the ocean uptake from the atmosphere. Those are the kind of things that we know a little bit better. At least the fossil fuel and the ocean part, and what remains in the atmosphere, we know a little bit better. What we don't know so much is how much land cover land use contributes, and how much the residual sink in the land is, how much the land is absorbing. So there are some estimates that comes from the kind of different approaches. One of them is bookkeeping model. That means to absorb all of the data sets that we know from countries that have reported in terms of their land cover land use change, and put it in a model and try to predict exactly how much emission or net emission comes from the land cover land use. And the figure at the bottom left basically presents that. And there are two models. One of them is from Woodsole Research Center from Ski Houghton Group, and another one is the new group that comes from a group in Hamburg, Max Planck Institute, which is called BLUE. And you notice that, and both of them are dependent on data set that comes from the United Nations from each country, and also some long time series of land cover land use data set that's been put together. You notice that the estimation of net emissions from these two models are extremely divergent. And global carbon projects, which basically every year reports it to the IPCC and globally, basically takes the average of these two, which is that brown curve, and assumes that's how much we have from the land cover land use. And the residual term, which is this picture in the forest that shows up here, is when you put the fossil fuel and this land cover to the atmosphere, and then subtract what is remaining in it, and also what's remaining in the ocean, you get something like around 3.2 petagram or gigatons of carbon per year going to the ecosystem. And this is all we know so far. A large uncertainty both on the carbon in terms of land cover land use, and therefore a large uncertainty on the sink as well. So if you look at the traditional way of balancing it, which is a mass balance of the carbon, you see that in general our sink is something like around 1.2 petagram plus minus 1.2 uncertainty that goes to ecosystem. By ecosystem, mainly we're thinking about forest, but non-forest is also important here. And because whatever is the sink is, it has to also compensate for the land cover that goes up. So this is it. But we don't know exactly how much is in the vegetation, how much is in the soil, and how much is it actually transfers through lateral transport from soil to the rivers and back to the oceans, or through that cycle. So if you look at the recent estimate of a boundless estimate, it tells us that actually a part of that goes to the rivers and to the ocean system, and partially that gets evaporated back to the atmosphere. And so the land part, the delta C on the land remains 0.9 plus minus 1.4. Large uncertainty again in this. So this is the problem we are tackling. A long introduction for where we are this time. So there have been several efforts. One effort is this paper by Pan et al. 2011 that tries to put all the forest inventory data, which is basically what foresters go in the field and measure. These are measurements that partially is done systematically and based some kind of statistical approach, such as in the US and Northern Hemisphere. And some of them are just kind of random points or data sets collected here and there. And they put this inventory products together for 2 periods in terms of carbon fluxes. And they're showing that actually on the average, it seems the forests absorb 1 petagram carbon from the atmosphere. But they don't really report how much of it is in the vegetation itself, how much of it is in the soil and other components. So that's what we have from inventory. But there is a major problem with the inventory. This is a figure I put together from looking at all the inventory data that has been available globally and looking at some estimates that we have where the carbon is and where the forest cover is. So if you look at the area of the total carbon storage, which is the green, the total area of the forest and shrublands, and mean carbon density, you notice the tropics is extremely important. The x-axis is the latitude. And the ground inventory data, which is kind of number of plots per 1,000 kilometers square is given here, is mainly dominated in the Northern Hemisphere, and especially in the Annex 1 countries, which these are basically the countries or developing world, and almost nothing in this area of the tropics. So inventory approach, unless it really covers these tropical part, it's going to be missing a major part of the carbon from the vegetation and the biosphere, and cannot really balance the problem very well. So the other approach is basically to bring in satellite data. This is where we come from at NASA. So there has been efforts to really fill this gap from inventory and other data set with the satellite data. On the vegetation, we know that the structure of the vegetation, if we measure them, and the cover, mainly the horizontal and vertical variations of the vegetation on the land, we would be able to kind of tackle this problem of carbon stored in the vegetation. And if we do that over time, we would be able to see exactly how that carbon is changing over time. So there are a lot of data sets, now being, at least in the past 10 years, being put together, past 10 to 20 years. The top is kind of a new data sets that the JEDI satellite and the space stations provides us, which is the samplings along the orbits of the vegetation height structure. And they're filling it as they go, and they sample this. It's supposed to be a 2-year programs, may get extended, so we might get some samples. Before that, we had the ISAT-1 glass data, and now we have the ISAT-2, which provided, it was designed for something else, but it also provided some interesting information on the vegetation structure globally. And then we have also done a lot of airborne measurements. Recently, over the Amazon, especially tropics, Congo Basin, and Asia, we have done some sampling with the airborne LiDAR data, which is kind of in systematic and statistically designed such that it can give us kind of an unbiased estimate of how much vegetation carbon is there. So we are trying to translate these things to the carbon numbers. In addition to that, we have also built satellites that can measure the atmosphere carbon. This is an animation from our CMS Flux projects, which basically uses the OCO2 data, which is the orbital carbon observatory that measures the carbon in the atmosphere, XCO2 and XCO, and then we use that with the model, data assimilation model at JPL, which is Cardamom, and try to estimate the net ecosystem production. So this is what you see here is land part. The red is basically emission, the blue is uptake. And this is only for a period of a summer during the El Nino of 2015. So basically the southern summer, basically you see a huge fire from El Nino dominating the carbon in the atmosphere in terms of emission. If you look at the same over a whole year during that year, so you can see a faster pace, you can see the red and blue changing from the southern summer to the northern summer, where the temperate and boreal ecosystem becomes a sink. They absorb a lot of carbon from atmosphere, they become blue, and then this cycle continues every year. So now we can estimate this thing global, the net biosphere exchange globally, but it's a very short period of time and this is still evolving. So how do we combine all of these data sets together? So from the bottom-up approach, inventory is one element, and if we bring in satellite observations from vegetation structure, we can actually probably estimate the carbon in the vegetation. And when we say carbon in the vegetation, we're thinking about several different pools of carbon. One is the live vegetation, which has an above in terms of a SAM cartoon that you see, the trees, and then below, which are basically the root that's live, and that basically has a mass, and that mass has carbon in it. And then there is dead pools or coarse woody debris and litter that are on the forest floor. It sometimes happens when forest trees die and remains in the forest, and then it takes time through a delay to go to the atmosphere. And then soil carbon, which is basically carbon that is stored in the soil through several other microbial processes. And in terms of vegetation, we not only dealing with forests, which is dominant part of the carbon, but there are kind of other type of vegetation in terms of thicket, kind of shrubby forest land and savannas and shrublands and even grasslands. They all contribute to some extent to this carbon cycle. And some of them, forest definitely has a much larger impact, but the other components are also important. So what we really can measure from the satellite data, soil, we hardly can do anything with the satellite observations. And for vegetation, we now have measurements that can help us with the photosynthesis and the entire productivity of the vegetation. Respiration, which basically what vegetation does and soil does in terms of exchanging part of that carbon that they absorb for photosynthesis back to the atmosphere, we really cannot measure that from the remote sensing. From live and dead pools we really cannot measure very well. Live pool we can from the biomass, and we can also monitor the disturbance and recovery process of these to a large extent. So here is basically the tools that we have in our hand to do this carbon balancing. So we basically rely on these data sets. If you think about the glass LiDAR data and look at the figure that I showed earlier in terms of the inventory being missing across a large part of the vegetation, especially in tropics, if you take the glass LiDAR data and put those samples across the whole forest, you notice that we have a very much a balanced sampling of entire vegetation globally, even though glass was not really designed very well and the sampling was not maybe enough, but it gives you a very good sampling systematic over the globe. Jet-eyed system is doing much better. Besides LiDAR, there is also radar systems globally being developed by NASA and NISAR and the European biomass missions that gives you a structure and estimates of vegetation biomass. And they're going to be launched in 2 years time periods from in 2022 timeframe. And they would be able to give a wall-to-wall mapping of the vegetation structure and carbon as well for different ecosystems. And the right side is basically examples of fire and forest cover change that we measure from MODIS at the bottom and Landsat from the top. And that has been done now annually, and we have an estimates of that. So that gives us some estimate of disturbance on the landscape. So the examples of the LiDAR data that we use to basically estimate the carbon are here. I'm going to go over it a little bit quickly. You see some examples of the samples here. So the sampling is pretty wide over the landscape. So if you take a box, which is like a 10-kilometer grid, you would get enough samples within that box, something like 25 to 50 samples, at least minimum of 25, that we can get an estimate of biomass in it. Over tropics, we also have, and also Northern Hemisphere, we have a lot of airborne data sets that can help us also to calibrate this and have a much better estimate, at least at the regional scale for the carbon data. So we use these LiDAR profiles and we assume these are like an inventory data on the ground. So if you take a 10-kilometer, you get these samples like inventory. If you take the top left pictures of that 10-kilometer, which I say field inventory, that's how people on the ground, they put the plot data on the ground, and they estimate the mean and variance for that landscape. For JEDI or ISAT, we have these orbital samples here. So they're a little bit clusters, but we know exactly how to estimate the mean and variance of that through that cluster. So for that 10-kilometer, we get an estimate of mean and so we need to go to a larger scale in order to be able to do this now. JEDI is supposed to do this at 1 kilometer. But with ISAT, we're not going to have enough samples within that 10-kilometer to get the mean right. Otherwise, the uncertainty would be really large. In addition to that, now that we have that carbon estimated for each 10-kilometer cell, as long as they have enough samples in them, we take a huge number of satellite data, which basically covers from 2000 to present, that allows us to get a time series of observation over the land that gives you a little bit from the structural information on what the canopy and system is doing in terms of disturbance and recovery, and also leaf area index or other type of attributes, not necessarily directly carbon, but some attributes of the landscape. When you aggregate these satellite data at 10-kilometer, the sensitivity of that to changes that happens becomes much larger. So we take all of these data sets, we train them with the glass data and inventory data from ground and airborne data through a kind of a spatial-temporal model. And that model is basically, I'm gonna shift. That model is basically, it's a machine learning model. So it takes all the data sets that you get from glass, from airborne, from inventory data. It takes some estimates from satellite data in the low vegetation that's been designed for different years, combine it in these multi-temporal data sets from 2000 to present, includes any ancillary data such as land cover might be available, topography, which is important, and actually tries to estimate carbon stock at that 10-kilometer cell annually, and then try to get some validation continuously and also correct for any biases that is in the system that we develop from these machine learning tools. So that's basically produces this time series of carbon in the system. And the bottom part is the emission and flux calculations that we can get back to it later. So if you do that from the machine learning approach, from this spatial temporal approach, we're not just doing some deep learning, I don't get into it. We have designed that to would improve the bias, because bias is really bad in terms of as you aggregate over the regions and you try to understand the time series variations, you really get into a area of large uncertainty that you cannot really derive any important information from. So our goal in this whole process to make sure we have, we can tolerate random error, but we really cannot tolerate bias in the system. So we do that, and we constantly cross-check this thing whenever data becomes available. So now we've finished the 2009-19 carbon, and the JEDI comes, we include that, we run the whole thing again to make sure the time series becomes again unbiased with any new data comes in. It doesn't not need to be satellite, but also the inventory data from different countries or regions. So this gives you a picture of how this carbon map looks globally. So it basically, and the histograms are from different regions that I put together. So you can actually see megagram per hectare is the pixel level values that you see. We did one version of this at much finer resolution for 2015, which we have a really good data set at 100 meter. So the histograms that you see is a little bit from that 100 meter data sets products, which is only for 1 year, that gives you the distribution of the biomass of above ground biomass of vegetation globally. We can take the above ground, use some models that exist on different ecosystems to convert it to below ground, because these two are tightly connected to each other for different ecosystems, and get the total live vegetation carbon density globally from these. The uncertainty looks like this globally. Every place that you have really high biomass, you have a chance of having high uncertainty. Again, these uncertainties are mainly random errors and not so much bias or systematic error. And we've tested these things over any area that we had good inventory data, such as the Annex 1 countries. So if you go look at these tests that we did for uncertainty, the left side is basically for areas where we have glass data in 1 degree with enough samples, which we put it as an independent test. And we noticed that basically hardly any bias exists between our map and these independent tests. And the right is basically numbers that the countries report to the FAO and United Nations annually. These are from Annex 1 countries, mainly Northern Hemisphere, European, and some Asian countries, and Australia. And you notice that again, on the country level, we're basically, our estimates, it has very low bias. And this was our goal in order to do these time series analysis. So moving forward, if you look at the picture here, you can easily estimate the carbon for each of these ecosystems, and you can also see the carbon variation. So this variation is basically the variance of the annual numbers from this 2000 to 2018. And you notice areas with the variance is large are areas which are extremely dynamic. So these are mainly areas where lower vegetations like savannas, woodlands that gets disturbed, or areas in the Northern Hemisphere where a lot of human activities are going on in terms of logging, wood extraction and harvest, expansion of agriculture, or fires and climate levels of disturbance. So it tells us that most of the areas that are extremely dynamic are actually not so much in the very dense, high biomass forests, but are in the medium to low biomass areas that gets really impacted and has these dynamic changes globally. If you look at the trend of these, 19 years of the data globally, you can see, you can ignore that term land sinks here, but just look at the trend of the biomass change from year to year. And you notice that there are areas that has declining trend, such as the Amazon basin, especially southern part of the Amazon has been hit by deforestation, forest degradations, and some level of droughts. There are areas in the tropics, such as the Congo basin, that seems like, and some of the woodlands seems like it's gaining biomass. Northern Hemisphere, the temperate and boreal forests, especially in North America and part of the Eurasia, is gaining carbon. So this is how these gain and loss of carbon can be detected from our analysis. All the numbers that you see here are significantly, statistically significant. So it means the values that we are showing is basically the values that we actually detect in these regions. You can look at it again. This is the 95% confidence interval. So you see that when you do the 95%, you lose a lot of areas that don't become significant, but it still shows you a large area of the globe in the top left picture. If you aggregate these things on each biome level or each ecosystem level, that means forget about the spatial variability, but look at that. You notice that almost the entire vegetation globally is gaining carbon. They're green. And except the new tropics, the Amazon basin, part of the Central America, and part of the Southeast Asia, especially the insular Asia in the islands. Everywhere else is gaining carbon. Some of the grasslands and stuff seems like in the temperate regions are also losing carbon, and maybe some areas in the savanna regions. But overall, the ecosystem is gaining. That's where the carbon sink in the vegetation basically comes from. You can look at also the trend and variability across different biomes globally from these pictures that we have. The colors around the gray areas or light blue areas along these curves are basically 95% confidence interval from our trend. So it basically tells us that sometimes year-to-year changes might be difficult to really absorb from, detect from our analysis, but long-term changes are possible. If you look at each country, you can also see that, you know, places like United States has been always a carbon sink in terms of vegetation. It's always carbon uptake, especially in the northwest and southeast regions of the US. Russian Federation is also has been, includes Siberia and a lot of these areas that has less human impact, but has been gaining carbon. China, because of the afforestation, is gaining carbon. But from the tropics, which are the bottom plots, you notice Brazil, Indonesia are two areas that are actually losing carbon, and Congo Basin, which includes mainly 3 countries dominant in the region, those are gaining carbon. So that tells you, you know, the human interactions and also partially climate effect on these carbon exchange in the atmosphere. Some of these results are not extremely new because people have been thinking about it, or some of the plot data has been showing it, but this is for the first time we actually provide spatial data, and we can actually look at these things a little bit in a more refined way. We can now look at the emissions and reduction and uptake. So that was basically carbon stored in the vegetation annually. So if you take the year-to-year changes of it, as I showed, you basically see the fluxes of carbon. It basically, you see the carbon changes. In order to attribute those to what is going on the land, we need to kind of try to get the land cover land use change element into it. Otherwise, it would just basically be a kind of a gross change of the carbon in the system, which is extremely valuable. But in order for policy implementation, RED project, and Paris Agreement, it's very important to basically separate these things in terms of what is the humans are doing over the landscape in terms of the changing it and how much we gain from maybe letting the system grow or restore forest. So there are several elements that impact this. Forest and non-forest transition has been always the dominant, especially in the tropics, where forest is being cut to plant, you know, crops or for pasture grazing land. Shifting cultivation, which is part of that system, is a system that mainly happens in the tropics, but it's existed in the northern hemisphere as well, but has declined significantly. It's mainly land being converted for a few years for agriculture and then gets abandoned. Forest grows in it, absorbs a lot of carbon, and then may get cut again. Wood harvest from logging, wildfire exists. Some of them overlaps with deforestation. Some of them exist just because of the climate and or spreads and impacts the forest. And there is afforestation, which is people planting forests or restoring forests in the land system. We really cannot do this thing all at the same time. They're very detailed, and our satellite observations are not really designed yet, or at least globally, we haven't been able to do all these elements, at least the 5 elements, very well. But locally, we've been able to do it because we have from very high resolution to moderate resolution satellite data to do it. Our goal here is to mainly look at deforestation and fire, or forest cover change and fire, to see exactly what are the emissions and uptakes from those. And we can do that because we have fire data, which is burn data, and we have deforestation or forest clearing data, which comes from Landsat time series. And we can take land cover maps that exist and then try to separate the forest and non-forest part of that, and then have an estimate by knowing the carbon before this disturbance happened and calculate the emissions from that. So you can see the emission from deforestation on the top. So it basically follows the deforestation trend over the land. There is emission from the fire, and we calculated it by separating the pixels, which is fire and deforestation. If deforestation happens, we calculate it under deforestation. And if it's fire, we calculate it over fire, such that we don't have the double counting of those, because it's, at least in the tropics, they happen over same areas. And then for the non-forest areas, we also calculate that. And you can see that a lot of emissions from non-forest areas, especially in the fires, is declining. This has been reported in several papers, that some of the fire incidences in part of the world is changing and declining. So we calculate those, and then once we calculate them, we can actually, for each pixel, we now have the emissions from deforestation, forest clearing, and emission from fire. We can subtract that from the delta biomass change or carbon change that we have, and calculate the total emission and residual uptake that comes from those pixels. And we can sum those up over different regions or different ecosystems. And these are a table that basically shows that the total carbon, which is this, and also the net change of the carbon in petagram per C, it includes the emissions and the regional C uptake of the carbon, and all given in petagram. And you can see the tropical part mainly dominates in terms of magnitude of both the emissions and also uptake. And so at the bottom, you see at the global total, you have huge emission coming in, like around 3.4 petagram, and you have close to 3.7 petagram that goes to the uptake. So if you take a picture on the right, you can see that from our bottom-up approach, the uptake of vegetation mainly compensates that emission that comes from these two dominant disturbance that happens. If you remember from the beginning of the slides, from the national inventory and bookkeeping, the entire ecosystems globally had a 0.9 petagram carbon per year, plus minus 1.4 on the uncertainty. And that 0.9 was a mixture of soil, live vegetation, dead pools, litter, and everything in it. And so we are basically seeing that almost that difference is around 0.4 for just live vegetation, at least from our analysis that comes out. So in terms of magnitude, it's not that different from what the bookkeeping gives globally, except now we know exactly where these sink and source are spatially and regionally. And we can talk about this balance from the residual here in this figure on the right much later, because we can use our data set combined with what fossil fuel and atmospheric measurements are, try to get, and what ocean is, try to get the residual sink, and notice that the residual sink has some component of the live vegetation, and there is a remaining part which we really don't account for, and that remaining part can be litter, soil, and maybe even some imbalance or movements of the carbon from different pools. And that goes down, which we put it here as an arrow of 1.4 petagram. These numbers are important for those who really care for the carbon balance in the atmosphere and the uncertainty around that. But for us here today, I think the fact that we can quantify these things with the satellite data to the level that are meaningful and corroborate some of the data set, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, and in terms of magnitude can separate different regions globally and allocate them from disturbance and recovery, it's very important. You can look at the variability of this also globally, and you notice that disturbance in general, this is some of the interesting findings we find. So if you take the Landsat time series and carbon associated with that, emissions, and the fire and the emission from that, and you plot it annually, you notice that the top two curves, these two really do not have so much interannual variability, or at least it's extremely small. The remaining part, which is the carbon sink or uptake from our analysis, has a much larger variability. Of course, when you take the interannual variability, since it's change, the uncertainty goes much larger in it. So you can see the uncertainties around these. The uncertainty on these emissions of deforestation and fire is much smaller because, in general, at the larger scale, our uncertainty of carbon numbers are smaller. And you can also compare that to the interannual variability of the atmospheric growth rate, which is on the right figure shown in green. You notice that also has a large variability compared to the disturbance variability. So from these two, we can actually conclude something very interesting, that the interannual variability on the terrestrial biosphere does not come so much from the disturbance, but it comes from the uptake. And this is a very interesting result. I think we thought about it a lot, but the fact that disturbance doesn't really have so much, although El Nino increases disturbance and there are these effects, but on the average comparison of land use and natural effects really do not have that much interannual variability compared to the uptake. And it shows both not only in our results, but also from other model results and also bookkeeping approach. So we want to actually delve into a little bit to what these interannual variability tells us and where is it coming from. So the next few minutes, I'm going to cover this part and then stop for question and answers. So let me just go, I'm going to skip this. So if you take the global interannual variability of our carbon and then the tropical part of that, you notice that globally, there are some correlations, but the correlation with the interannual growth rate is very small. To do that, the interannual growth rate, basically, we inverse that and take the basically year-to-year change it, so it becomes similar to what we are doing from bottom-up approach. So the blue and red curves becomes, the same sign. And so the top basically shows globally, the bottom shows over the tropics. So you notice that huge correspondence between two. Remember, the first one, the red or the orange ones from atmosphere, is basically pure measurements of the atmosphere. And the blue one is what we did from our exercise that I showed it to you. You can actually look at the contribution from each component of the vegetation that comes in the tropics. You notice that there is a large component of the moist tropic. There is a large component also from the dry woodlands and shrub, and a much smaller component from the grassland. So this basically, tropical ecoregions dominate the interannual variability of the atmospheric growth rate. You can also separate, and this is exactly the same curve. We basically put the moist tropic and add the subtropical dry regions and subtropical non-forest, and you can actually see how they contribute gradually to creating something like 78% explaining the interannual variability. The rest of them comes from what the Northern Hemisphere is doing. We try to separate this thing again from the disturbance and recovery. As you notice, globally, disturbance doesn't have any interannual variability strongly. And we did this thing through a kind of a mass balance approach that we have here to separate the loss and gain for each of our pixels, and then try to separate the losses from deforestation and fire, take the part which is the gain, which is the net gain of vegetation from all the other activities, and then correlate that. And you notice that, again, both in this picture, and if you look at on our next results, you see that. Again, for tropics, the disturbance has no correlations with the interannual variability. The blue is the loss from deforestation and fire, and then together, and then gain, although from deforestation and fire and together, has a large correlation with the atmospheric growth rate. This is just basically desegregating those into different components. So uptake of carbon is extremely important for this. Now, the question is why this uptake is important. So, and is it due to the basically climate effect, or due to the CO2 fertilization effect that causes the uptake of carbon becoming important? So we really cannot deal with the CO2 fertilization because we don't have any ability with these type of techniques to address that. But we decided to look at areas which are intact for us in the tropics to see how much they contribute. And it's very hard to see where the intact forests are. So we took only these 2000 to present deforestation and fire data, and we look at 1% disturbance within a 10 kilometer pixels and 0.1% disturbance to separate the areas that remain intact. So if you look at the 0.1% disturbance in each pixel, that means anything less than more than 0.1% disturbance has been excluded from our analysis. Those are those orange areas. So that areas of green are areas which are intact for us, more or less. So if you look at the interannual variation of that and the atmospheric growth rate, you notice that the correlation declines significantly. But areas that has been disturbed and going through the recovery still remains correlated with the atmospheric growth rate. So we can, from this, conclude that probably areas that is going under recovery are more important to explain the atmospheric growth rate than areas which are intact forests. And this idea that the intact forest is still growing in carbon, it might be true because of the atmospheric CO2 fertilization. However, we really cannot detect it very well because the growth is very small. It needs much longer time series of observation, and maybe is within our margin of errors when we look at these old growth forests. Recently, there have been other results published. This is just new. It came out, I think, this month, couple of weeks ago. Sullivan et al. 2020. It looks at all the tropical forest plot data over past 20 some years and try to see if there is any correlation between those and temperature data to see if climate impacts the gain of the carbon from these plot data networks. And they showed that actually the maximum daily temperature explaining the changes of the carbon stock, especially decline of the carbon stock, and also decline of the carbon gain, that means the productivity, both has been impacted by the maximum temperature in a declining way. And the residence time hasn't, but that's a different story we can get into. So there are some indications that there is, although these are undisturbed forests, it basically means that the sink in the intact forest might be actually lower than we think over the past 20 years. And maybe that's the reason that we don't see a major signal coming out of that. We also looked at this thing with the temperature and climate with our data. We noticed that temperature and climate, and precipitation impacts what we get from these biomass changes or carbon changes throughout. Usually temperature in the tropics has an adverse effect. As temperature increases, carbon declines. So this is similar to what they have shown in their paper. And our paper in this is not published yet, but we have done this from our measurement, except Central Africa, that shows resilience to this, because I think partially because these forests are being maybe impacted by climate before temperature, and also they are in higher elevations, so they're cooler than the Amazon, so a little bit of temperature rise may not maybe impact them as much. Precipitation has a different effect. As you increase precipitation, these forests are doing much better, and except in the Central Africa, but that might be due to the impact of the increasing cloud cover and declining of radiations, an artifact of our analysis. And these things vary regionally, that globally temperature dominates in terms of explaining both atmospheric CO2 growth rate and changes of the carbon cycle, but regionally, precipitation might be more important in terms of explaining the changes. Similar curve has been produced by other groups to show this impact of temperature and precipitation globally. So we think that's the fact. And this is the couple of last slides, that if you look at the globally and the pantropic, this is the trends from temperature, VPD, which is vapor pressure deficit, and the length of the dry season or rainfall during the dry season or driest quarter globally. And this is an index. The red means there is much larger trend, significant trend. The blue means less. And areas which are gray means there is no significant. So you notice that there is a huge temperature change. Africa has been impacted by temperature, but seems to be more resilient. Amazon, southern Amazon, and even northwestern Amazon has been impacted by temperature. Asia as well. The most interesting part is the VPD, vapor pressure deficit, which we published a paper on it last year over the Amazon. It shows increasing, and that basically means atmospheric drying demand might be much larger for these vegetations, and that might impact the function of the vegetation. And the same thing for the dry season. And if you look at that, we've shown that drought can affect that. This is the basically 2005 drought example here in the bottom left corner. This is the impact of the drought index over this century, showing the southern Amazon is getting more drought, although the temperature is changing in the Africa, but the drought impact is less there than the Amazon. And if you look at the impact of the drought, this is the paper we published, Yan et al. In 2017. It shows that over mortality of the trees increases gradually because of these episodic drought, and then that declines the carbon in these intact forests over a period of time of 3-4 years. So I'm gonna stop basically here and summarize in few points. One is we can basically use a hybrid approach of the satellite imagery and airborne data, whatever we have, to basically come up with an alternative approach to get estimate of the terrestrial biosphere carbon exchange. By that I mean live vegetation with the atmosphere, without necessarily having detailed attributions of where this comes from, except maybe from deforestation and the fire. We showed that both tropics and extratropics are important for the vegetation carbon sink. Tropics apparently is becoming more important by being dynamic and also having a much larger effect. Interannual variability atmospheric growth rate is dominated by what is going on in tropics and hardly anything from the northern hemisphere. It seems northern hemisphere explains the secular trend more, and tropics explains the interannual variability. And then disturbance and recovery are also important to explain this, except disturbance doesn't really explain the interannual variability. It's the uptake or recovery after disturbance that correlates with climate and other environmental conditions that causes this interannual variability in the atmospheric growth rate. So I'll stop here and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple questions.
I hope more.
I think if
I
you're
covered
willing
the
to
whole.
stay a bit, people
Yeah,
are
I can stay,
welcome
but
to
since I covered more than 45 minutes, so please, if there's questions, I would stay.
Okay, sounds great. Does anybody have a question for Dr. Saatchi? Feel
I
free
know we
to.
have a meeting after this with the ecosystem group there, so probably there would be more discussion points there.
True.
This is Sassan. I have a question. This is Jim.
Sure.
Sassan?
Go ahead.
It seems like you made the comparison with the results from PAN at the beginning of your talk, and it seems to me like the PAN. Tell me if this is wrong, but they were able to account for almost all of the sink in the vegetation. A lot of it was in the above ground biomass, but your estimates really place. You find lower estimates in many places than PAN, right? Is that correct? For the
We do,
carbon in the
because
vegetation?
I mean, what is the difference is PAN probably is much better in the northern hemisphere because they use some of the inventory data from northern countries, but their estimate over tropics is just from some of these plot data that from previously they used the plot data from rainfall, for example, that they were showing almost 0.5 petagram carbon in the above ground sink, and they, if you remember, they associated that with the atmosphere with CO2 fertilization. Since then, their results have actually changed with few papers they publish. They really show actually in the 21st century, those numbers are not really valid. So from 1 petagram that PAN shows, and also 1 petagram of PAN, you're right, is largely in the above ground, in the live biomass compared to other pools. But she doesn't completely separate those because the carbon number in the soils, and there are indications that if soil emission is larger, your sink becomes lower. So therefore, there are indications in northern hemisphere there is much larger source in the carbon from the soil, and that 1 petagram can really switch or become lower. So we are showing globally it's around 0.4 petagram annually on the vegetation growing instead of 1. And in some regions more. That actually in tropics we show that the wet tropics is lower except in Africa, but the dry tropics has much larger influence, and that has been already supported by a couple of other products and modeling activities going on. So my explanation is either we are all within the uncertainty on the land part, and we are like kind of playing with that uncertainty, our numbers are going back and forth, or there are these signals that comes in and you really cannot deal with the signal very well when you really have a systematic observation for each region to be able to say what that region is. Otherwise, aggregating data from different sources and different level of accuracy can completely miss, some sink and source terms. So
thanks, Sassan.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Are there any? Oh, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jen. Thanks for the talk. I have a quick question regarding your uncertainty plot that you had. So in the Pacific Northwest, there was really high uncertainty. And I was wondering why that is when we have a bunch of, so this one. So if you look at the West Coast US, there's appears to be really high uncertainty there. And I'm wondering why is that, considering we have a lot of data in this region, I would imagine.
That's true. Remember the data we have for this region from inventory data, we have almost now 2 inventories in the past 20 years, because Pacific Northwest inventory from Forest Service was always limited. East Coast has much more frequent observations. Right now, we have 2 complete inventories from the Pacific Northwest. Although we use that data set in, remember, part of that, the system is also extremely dynamic. So if you look at this curve, the biomass. The biomass itself, the carbon stock in these areas is extremely large. So the larger the carbon stock, the error we have is large. Suppose our methodology has a 10% error across the board. When you have a forest which has 1,000 tons of biomass or carbon, the 10% can be huge, right? And if it's dynamic, that means it's changing to some extent because the landscape is fragmented, there are logging happening and intact forests happening. Our errors in terms of estimating that becomes much larger. So this map is actually a good map. Any place that you have higher biomass or higher carbon, our errors is larger too, in general. If I do relative error, that means take the absolute error divided by the carbon, then it would become the opposite. Then it becomes, those errors becomes lower, and areas which are low vegetation, the error becomes larger. Suppose an area has 10 megagram of biomass, and you're estimating 10, you have 100% error, plus minus 5, if you estimate 5 or 15. Our sensitivity works like that. The middle part of the biomass, we're doing much better. Very low and very high, we're usually doing worse. This is part of the kind of modeling. If you think about the regression curve, it does the same thing. Regression always overfits. Even the worst regression with R square of 0 always gives the mean over large areas correctly and takes the both ends and causes problem. It's kind of like an overfitting with this. So whenever we have these cases, usually we have this problem. The same thing goes with inventory data. The inventory data is much worse because the allometric models for large trees has larger errors than small trees because there is less large trees is being cut and weighted to include in it. Especially in the Pacific Northwest, we really have bad allometry from ground measurements to estimate the carbon. It's been known for years because you really cannot cut a redwood and do that. And people have done terrestrial LiDAR observation from these forests, and they show that there is a much larger difference in terms of the biomass you get from terrestrial LiDAR and you get it from the inventory data, just because the allometry in estimating carbon is very difficult for these forests. So in general, our uncertainty is very much similar to what the uncertainty are available on the ground as well.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Saatchi? Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us for today's seminar.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening.